conjunction with our Sherlock Holmes exhibition. How many have seen the Sherlock Holmes exhibit? And you don't really see the exhibit, you have to work. You're put to the task. So if you haven't done it, plan enough time, you actually solve a crime and investigate, and it's a pretty fun exhibit and very well done. So in our lecture series, we're paying tribute to a little bit of the Sherlockian history and also modern high-tech forensics. So that's what we're doing this evening. And then we'll be back with Sherlock Holmes in August. Nothing planned in July. But we will have Sherlockian and film historian Dr. Warren Chaney here, and he's going to do Sherlock Holmes, the evolution of a timeless character. And he's going to be using clips from films and even silent films and movies to kind of dissect the character. And then Dr. Chaney will be back for a film screening of the original The Hound of the Baskervilles. We'll switch back to high-tech forensics in September, and we have the original developer of geographic profiling, Dr. Ken Rossmo, and he has actually done geographic profiling on Jack the Ripper. So that's gonna be a fascinating talk. And then followed by, also in September, forensic sculptor Amanda Danning. And her work is in over 150 museums in the United States, including this one. Okay. And now I'm happy to introduce Gordon D. Smith. Mr. Smith is no stranger to the Houston Museum of Natural Science. He actually serves on the museum's anthropology committee. His father, Gordon W. Smith, gave a lecture on his extensive collection of American Indian art and cultural artifacts 10 years ago here at the museum. And it was just a couple years before he passed away. And I'm pretty sure they are the only father-son duo that has spoken at the museum. And the Gordon W. Smith Native American Collection is now part of the HMS Permanent Collection, and it will be featured in an upcoming renovation of the Hall of the Americas. And along that same lines, Gordon D. Smith, who's with us tonight, studied music theory, but also archaeology and did field work in Latin America. All that on his path to security investigation, which he has now done for the past 23 years. So he is a specialist in intelligence, foreign policy, and global change. He works in the areas of transactional and investment intelligence, political and change risk analysis, and media and cultural production. He is the founder, principal, and CEO of the private intelligence agency Strategic Insight Group, and has led investigation projects for over $60 billion in investment transactions. He's worked in 90 countries around the world and has conducted investigations of thousands of individuals, companies, and situations. Please help me welcome Gordon D. Smith.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great to be here and be at home in a place that I think of as another home, the Houston Museum of Natural Science, one of the great institutions in the country. And I'm just delighted to be able to talk to you tonight a little bit about what I do for a living, in addition to all the other things that I'm interested in. And this is the world of intelligence. So I want to take you through a little bit about why intelligence is different as a subject from other kinds of research, what we use in the intelligence world, how we approach things, the methodologies, and also the things that we look out for, the things that can actually take an intelligence investigation in the wrong directions. And then I'll give you some examples of some cases that I've done, names changed to protect the guilty or innocent as the case may be. So the first question is, what is intelligence? What do we mean by intelligence as a subject of a kind of research? And the essential thing about intelligence is that it is a more advanced level of research with the goal of leading to deeper, more revealing understanding and insight into a situation, into entities, events, and people. And it's different from the kind of research that I think probably everybody has done here, where you find pieces of information. I guess it didn't like that. You find pieces of information and put those together and summarize articles and that sort of thing. This is a different kind of thing. So what is intelligence? This is the definition that you would get if you went to the CIA or the DIA or any of the intelligence agencies of any major government in the world. It's specifically or specially prepared information or knowledge designed to meet the specific tactical, operational, or strategic needs of the end user. And that also they do call them clients in that world. So what intelligence does is it collects lots of little pieces of information from lots of different sources, any one of which, shall we switch? Yes. Okay. Technical problem. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes. All right. So it collects lots of little pieces of information from lots of different sources. Each piece is not necessarily important on its own. It may be. It's certainly important if you find out that somebody, is a felon and a murderer. That in itself is a pretty important piece of information. But it's not necessarily, and I will show you what I mean by that. But the intelligence technique uses special approaches, essentially, to find patterns and anomalies. Now, patterns are things that repeat, and anomalies are things that violate or go against things that repeat. So, what are you trying to do? You're trying to reveal hidden information, things that people don't expect you to know, maybe things people don't want you to know, things that are emerging elements or early warning of trends, and looking at structures and drivers that are under the surface of a situation so that you can have more insight. And the goal of all this is to create actionable intelligence, actionable insight, something you can actually use to take action. And that is another key distinguisher of the intelligence world. So there are a lot of things that differentiate intelligence. One is multiple kinds of data. So you don't want to look at just a certain class or category of information. You want to look across categories because it's finding things that connect across categories that can really give you insight into situations. And of course that means from lots of different sources of data. And we'll get into what this means in a moment. You use multiple different methodologies to analyze this because, again, each method has its strengths and weaknesses, and what you're trying to do is gain an insight into something. You're trying to see under the surface. You're not trying to just summarize what everybody knows. So intelligence really can be thought of as not what everybody knows about something. You're looking for something different. This last thing on this slide is a key issue. It's called zero-based analysis. And zero-based analysis is probably more important now than ever. What it means is that you don't know the answers when you go in. You don't actually go in looking for information that verifies what you think you already know, quote unquote, about a situation. What you're looking for are patterns that can tell you something you didn't know. And right now in the world, this is a big problem, and it's sometimes called confirmation bias. Is another technical term for it. But what it means is that when people look at things, and this is, we could get into a whole discussion about the fake news phenomenon and so forth, but people tend to look at information and pay attention to information that verifies what they already think they know or what they believe about a subject. That is bad intelligence. That will lead you astray. And most of my clients are investors, and investors are typically not interested in our doing that kind of work because it could cost them a lot of money. They go in believing certain things, and they want us to test them or falsify them. Because if we can't falsify them, then you can consider them verified. And this is a key element as well. So a lot of people think that you look in a research discipline for information that verifies a topic. That's actually not what we do in the intelligence discipline. And it shares a great deal with scientific methodology. And scientific methodology is based on collecting an array of information, looking at it, creating a hypothesis about what might be going on, and then collecting more information to verify or falsify that hypothesis with an emphasis on trying to falsify it. So, in other words, we think this is going on. If we can find that, then that would falsify that. That would mean that it's not going on. So let's look for the thing that tells us that it might be not correct, what our hypothesis is. That is a fundamental element in good science methodology, and it is also a fundamental element in the intelligence methodology. So that is essentially a kind of radical doubt or skepticism about everything. And it's kind of, sometimes the term heuristics is used for rules of thumb. So things that everybody knows, things that make sense, things that are common sense, and so forth. Intelligence intentionally violates that because it is the only way to get outside of the assumptions that you make about the world is to take the assumption that they're wrong and start from that premise. And so that's why I say it's a kind of radical doubt. And when you practice it long enough, it almost becomes part of your way of seeing the world. Now, another element about intelligence, as I mentioned, is that we look at lots of different pieces of information from lots of different sources. So here is just a spreadsheet, and let's just say that represents rows of data, columns of data in different categories. So traditional research, if you were looking at a subject, let's say a person, you wanted to see if this person was somebody you wanted to babysit your child, or you wanted to do something, in business with. And so you might look at a couple of categories. So let's say you did a criminal record search, and you looked on their Facebook page, or their social media, Instagram, whatever it was. And, you look there, well, if in fact what tells you about that person is that they have a criminal record, or they don't, or that they have certain things on their Facebook page that you might not want your children to be associated with, then you'll find that out. But what if the things that tell you about the person are somewhere else? What if they're in terms of litigation, that this person sues or gets sued by everybody that they deal with? Or what if they're in terms of just a pattern of personal activity that's on the edge, like lots of driving citations or DUIs, but never enough to be a serious criminal record, or many other things. So if you just look at a couple of elements, you'll miss that, and you won't actually get a picture of what this person is like and whether you want them to babysit your child. So the intelligence approach, even at a shallow level, goes wide. And so you sweep across lots of different categories of data. You find the key elements. When you find something that's important, you drill down further, and then you connect the dots. And that is essentially, in a simplistic way, how intelligence works. So you always want to go wide, even if you're not going deep. The ideal, of course, is to go wide and deep, but that's not possible in every project. So another way of thinking about intelligence is that the way you can create accurate findings is where intersection points happen in data arrays. So this is sometimes called corroboration, and it means that you find things that overlap. So I've got listed here 5 different categories: public data, which is all kinds of records that are out there available. Many of them electronic, although there are problems with that. We'll get to that in a minute. Litigation, media, verifications. In other words, verifications would mean somebody claims they went to Rice University and got a degree. Well, did they really? You'd be surprised how often they actually didn't. Lots of different kinds of data. So if you start to see a pattern, well, this person has got 4 or 5 litigation cases. They claim to have a degree. The university can't verify it. They've got some negative articles in the media. There's some questions in public data, maybe about debt records and that sort of thing. And you start to see a pattern that tells you that something coherent is going on, that there's some coherence or congruence between these different kinds of data. That is a signal, and that's what you're looking for. That's an intelligence finding. Similarly, Finding none of that tells you something too, and we'll get to what that means in a minute. There are two essential intellectual devices that govern intelligence processes. One is called the knowledge or intelligence pyramid, and I'm going to walk you through this because it's sort of an interesting device. This is all from the world of government intelligence. I used to work for Defense Intelligence Agency, but you would find this in almost any intelligence discipline anywhere in the world. So you can divide knowledge into three general areas, and at the base of the fundamental one is background information. So this is information that's common, broad information, easily available. The next element is specific but broad information. So you're getting a little bit more into understanding the specific environment of the situation, the specific elements, still fairly broad. As you go up the pyramid, you get into specific and focused information, and that lets you start to understand subtopics and key elements and topics that give you some more insight into the situation. At the top of this part of the pyramid is information with a strategic focus. That's the world of long-term planning, policy, strategic planning, that sort of thing, and that is where most research stops. The next two tiers are the world of intelligence, and that's world information with an operational focus, and that supports planning and shorter and medium-term strategy, and then information with a tactical focus, and that supports immediate decision-making and taking action. And so the characteristics of the pyramid are, as you move up these elements, these levels or layers, your focus narrows what you're studying, your insight increases, and your actionability increases, your ability to take action. So the bottom is the world of basic information. The blue area is the world of standard research, and the gold at the top is the area of intelligence. So that's the intelligence pyramid, and it is as I say, it's an intellectual device that helps frame how intelligence works. The next thing I want to talk about is the intelligence cycle, and I've got a little graphic here if I can get it to go back. And if not, we'll go with it the way it wants to do it. Anyway, so the intelligence cycle has these 6 nodes on it: project definition, planning, collection, analysis, production, and dissemination. And those elements are the classical parts of any good intelligence investigation. So we start with planning or goal definition. And looks like I've got a frozen laptop here. Hold on just a second. We're having lots of technical problems today. Let's see. Well, I may have to just kill this and restart it. Sorry about that. The intelligence cycle, here we are. Okay, so let's see if it'll let me do this. Okay, so it essentially starts with project or goal definition, and it's really, really important to define your project, to define your goals. I see more projects go south because they did not define the goals that they're looking about. And I'll give you a good example. So if you say, if someone says to me, I want to know everything about this person. Well, what do you want to know? Their underwear size? Do you want to know what they eat for breakfast? Is that really relevant to to what you're doing? What you want to know needs to be specifically relevant to what your actionability is. So you want to know if they're, a trustworthy business partner. You want to know if they're getting into litigation. You want to know if the contacts they claim to have are really as powerful as they say they are. Those are all decent questions. So you work with a client to define the exact needs or problems. It's called narrowing the issues. You define specific outcomes, as I said. What is it that is going to help you to know about this situation or this person or this entity? And then you create a means to measure success. If we get to this, then we've succeeded in this project. So here are some of the kinds of questions that are actually good intelligence questions. What are an opposing litigant's weaknesses and vulnerabilities? It's a very good question, can be done. How do customers really perceive our products and services? Another kind of a good intelligence question. Which markets or opportunities should we pursue?
Should we go into South America? Should we go into Africa? Should we go into this new element of production that's related but distinct from what we're doing? Will an opponent in a lawsuit fight to the end or settle? I've been asked that question many times, and that's a very good question, because if you can establish the likelihood of someone either fighting to the end or settling, it affects your legal strategy, as you can imagine. Will our two biggest competitors merge? Another big question. Who are our investors? How are they likely to behave? What are there hidden associations driving a business situation that we can't see, but we see that these two parties are working together in some way, or they're working in similar directions, but there doesn't seem to be any link that ties them together. So can we find a link like that? Has there been a theft of intellectual property? That's a big question that gets into the forensics that we were talking about. What's the real background of a target for investment? We're putting all this money into this investment. What's this person or this group? What are they really like in terms of their abilities to do what they say they're going to do, in terms of whether they're good or bad operators and so forth. So those are all projects. Now I'm going to skip to collection. So collection means that you're obviously collecting information. So there are these. I'm talking. There's several things, but we've talked about open source intelligence, and I'm going to start with that. Open source means it's in the public domain somewhere, and so this is information that is somewhere in the world. It is in a database. It's in some kind of an accessible form. It may be electronically accessible. More and more nowadays, it's not as easily accessible electronically. But there is an enormous amount of information. The CIA estimates that over 90% of all information is available in open source somewhere. You have to know the right language, and you have to know where to find it, but that's called information architecture, where information is stored, and you have to know how to put it together. So OSINT is the technical term for this. It means open source intelligence, and it means it's in the public domain somewhere. Now, as a general rule, the kind of intelligence that a firm like Strategic Insight Group, my firm, does, is based on this kind of a layout of information. So about the biggest portion is in what are called proprietary or specialized databases. And these are databases that are generally open in the sense that the data can be purchased. And there are databases on all sorts of things, dairy bacteriology, piracy in the South China Sea, you name it. But they're not generally in the open internet. You have to know where to get them, and you have to pay money to get them. And sometimes they're very expensive. You have about 30%, maybe a little bit less now, that's in the general internet. You have this world of restricted data, which I'll get to in a minute, and you have the world of gray or ephemeral data. And that's an interesting topic. Gray or ephemeral data is the kind of information that people pass out at conferences. And, you'll often, I don't know how many of you attend conferences, but you'll get these very detailed documents sometimes from presenters at the conferences, from the organizers of the conference. Those have information that's generally not publicly available, but it's not restricted. Now, some conferences have a rule that is called not for attribution, and I go to a number of those conferences, and those you cannot actually say where you got the information, but you can use it. And so that's the world of gray or ephemeral data. Now, the next category I want to talk about is the world beyond open source. So there's a lot of information. This world is changing dramatically with the arrival of a bunch of things like the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, in Europe, which went into effect last month, almost exactly a month ago. But there is a lot of information out there about people's lives, as we know. I'm sure all of you know. But there's a lot of information that can only be accessed if you have special kinds of permission. You're a licensed investigator, for example, or you're a bank, and so forth. And in many cases, it requires the individual's permission to do it. And that's increasing, and I think that's a good thing, actually. But these are the sort of things that you could consider restricted data. Now I want to talk a little bit about human intelligence, or HUMINT is the technical term for that. Human intelligence is collecting information from live subjects. So that what we talked about before, the OSINT, is passive. It's just information that's out there. If you know where to get it, you can you can go for it, and you can get it. And in most cases, except for the restricted data, it's openly available. Human information requires interaction with another person. And there's a very broad array of techniques, some of which are used more in market research, some of which are used more in the world of intelligence. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with intercept interviews, and you've probably been stopped in a store, and surveys and that sort of thing. As you know, those are commonly accepted types of research. Ethnographic research is an anthropological discipline that has now been turned into a commercial, consumer discipline. So people look at consumers in terms of ethnography. What ethnography does is study how people actually act and observe how people act and ask them why they act a certain way, as opposed to getting people to simply describe what they do. So, you know, you might have someone who says, well, I'm a gourmet and I only drink, I grind my coffee. I only drink coffee that is fresh ground. Well, if you actually observe that person, what you might find, this is the actual case, is that they do that on Saturday and Sunday, but Monday through Friday, they actually get it out of the can. And so less than half the time, they're actually doing what they claim they're doing. But this is an aspirational thing. They identify themselves as doing that. And this is very widespread. We as human beings have a very, very inaccurate view of our own behavior and our own attitudes. And so ethnography tries to peel that apart and see what people actually do. As you get over here into, you know, some of these more exotic, perhaps, elements, you get into the world of true intelligence, surveillance, cloaked elicitation, also known as pretexted elicitation. And these things are used for all sorts of areas. And I will, you know, these last ones here are used for clandestine operations. By the way, the term in intelligence is clandestine, not covert. So if somebody talks about covert, they probably don't really know what they're talking about. But clandestine operations are operations that are carried out without the knowledge of the subject being investigated. And those are done, obviously, quite a bit in the government world. They are done in the private sector. A lot of times, and surveillance is a classic example of that. There are also techniques that it's legal for companies to use if they are surveilling or collecting data on how an employee is using a computer. That's the company's computer. They can put something called a keystroke logger on the computer and essentially record every keystroke that the person types into a computer. These things are not uncommon. There are other elements of surveillance that go on, and we could spend the whole time on this, which I'm not going to do, but just to give you another example of the kinds of ways this is intersecting with technology. I'm sure you've all been to the airport and, you know, put your card into a machine and or your passport or whatever to get your ticket, the automatic ticket. Those machines have a camera in them that uses a technology, an Israeli technology, to read your facial emotions. And if they detect that you're upset, they will note that on the record. That's just something you should know. That is how so that is that's an example of the kind of electronic. And this is everywhere. So, and it's becoming more and more pronounced. Imagery intelligence, or IMINT, is the taking of pictures, as you might imagine. And there are classically three kinds: ground plane, airborne, and spaceborne. And a ground plane obviously means, you know, just standing somewhere and taking a picture. Often it's a clandestine operation where you're taking a picture of somebody. They don't know the picture's being taken. Airborne is obviously from an airplane or a drone. And spaceborne is kind of the most exotic and in some ways the most fun to talk about. So I'm going to show you, this is a kind of a run-of-the-mill, everyday kind of picture that now is provided by a number of commercial satellite providers. This one is the QuickBird. And what you notice on this is an airfield in California. But notice that you can actually resolve